Let's start by preheating our oven to 350 degrees. Okay, now let's take our flour and we're going to sift it into our bowl. Okay, now let's take our sugar and sift it into our bowl as well. And now let's move on to our next step. Now let's put our butter into our pan and turn it on to low heat. And let's melt our butter. Okay. Now let's pour in our Coca-Cola or any other soda. And now let's add our cocoa powder. And let's move on to our next step. Okay, now let's mix it together a little bit. And we'll let that bring itself to a boil. Okay, now we're going to mix our Coke mixture into our flour. Mix it together just like this.
Just like this. Slowly.
Now let's move on to our next step. Okay, now let's pour in our vanilla, and then let's pour in our buttermilk, and now let's pour in our baking soda and our salt, and our eggs. And now let's mix this together. Now let's move on to our next step. Okay, now let's pour our batter into our pan. Make sure to scrape it with a rubber spatula.
Just like this.
Now let's move on to our next step. Okay, now let's bake our cake at 350 degrees for 35 minutes. And I'll show you the next step. Okay, now let's put our butter into our pan and melt on low heat. And I'll show you the next step. Now let's add our Coke or any other soda, and our cocoa, and let's move on to our next step. Okay, now let's pour our powdered sugar into our pan. And add our vanilla. Now let's mix this together. And now let's move on to our next step. Okay, now let's take our icing and pour it on top of our cake. Just
like this.
And I'll show you the finished product. This is our finished product.